What happens when the system designed to protect you becomes your cage? For billionaire industrialist Donovan Sterling, the answer came in a packed Manhattan courtroom, accused of a fraud so vast it threatened to shatter his empire. He was already a convicted man in the eyes of the public. But the ultimate betrayal wasn't the prosecution's damning evidence. It was the moment his own lawyer, the man he paid millions to defend him, packed his briefcase and walked away mid-trial. In that deafening silence, with his life hanging by a thread, an unexpected voice cut through the despair. It wasn't a lawyer, it was his maid. Donovan Sterling existed in a world meticulously crafted to insulate him from the mundane and the unpleasant. His penthouse on Park Avenue was less a home and more a museum of his own success, a silent testament to a life spent conquering markets and crushing competitors. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's-eye view of New York City, but Donovan rarely looked at it. For him, the city wasn't a tapestry of human lives. It was a grid of assets and liabilities, a game board he had long since mastered. He was a man of routines, not relationships. His mornings were a silent ballet of precision. At precisely 6:00 a.m., his coffee, a specific single-origin bean from a remote Guatemalan village, would be on the marble island in his kitchen, heated to exactly 197 degrees Fahrenheit. His suit, always a deep charcoal grey, from a tailor in Savile Row, would be laid out on his bed. The Wall Street Journal would be ironed. These things didn't happen by magic. They happened because of Isabella Rossi. Isabella had been in Donovan's employ for 22 years. She was a ghost in the machine of his life, a silent presence who knew the precise weight of the silence in his home. She knew he preferred his steaks seared to a specific millimeter, that he slept on the left side of his king-sized bed, and that he never ever spoke of his late wife, whose portrait, a vibrant painting of a smiling woman in a field of sunflowers, was the only object in the penthouse that seemed out of place, a splash of chaotic warmth in a world of cool chrome and polished stone. Isabella was a black woman of quiet dignity, with eyes that saw far more than they let on. She had come to America from Trinidad as a young woman, her dreams as vast and blue as the Caribbean Sea she'd left behind. Life had tempered those dreams, sanding them down into a quiet resilience. She'd raised a son, sent him to college, and watched him become a teacher, all on the salary she earned, managing the sterile perfection of Donovan Sterling's life. She saw the man behind the myth. She saw the way his shoulders slumped when he thought no one was watching. She saw the untouched dinner trays on the nights the market had been particularly brutal, and she saw the small, almost imperceptible acts of a man grappling with a loneliness so profound it had become a part of the architecture. She was the one who found the crumpled drafts of letters to his estranged son, Leo. Letters filled with a stilted, awkward affection that were always thrown away before they could be sent. She was the one who boxed up the anonymous multi-million-dollar donations to children's hospitals and disaster relief funds, transactions that never bore the Sterling name. She knew his secrets, not the salacious kind the tabloids would pay a fortune for, but the deeper, more human secrets of a man who had built a fortress around his heart. The indictment came down on a Tuesday. Securities fraud, wire fraud, money laundering. The charges were a complex web of transactions, shell corporations, and offshore accounts that the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, a ferociously ambitious prosecutor named Jasmine Reed, painted as a predatory scheme of breathtaking arrogance. Reed presented a narrative of a ruthless plutocrat who siphoned money from pension funds and charitable foundations to finance his own lavish lifestyle. It was a story the media and the public consumed with ravenous delight. Donovan Sterling, the titan of industry, was about to be brought low. To defend himself, Donovan hired the best lawyer money could buy, Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a legend in legal circles, a shark in a $1,000 suit with a silver tongue and a win-loss record that was the envy of every attorney in New York. He was confident, charismatic, and radiated an aura of invincibility. "Don't you worry, Don," Thorne had said in their initial meeting, clapping Donovan on the back with a familiarity that felt entirely unearned. "This is just noise. Prosecutor Reed is trying to make a name for herself. We'll bury her in paperwork files, so many motions her head will spin. We'll make this so boring and so complicated, the jury will be begging to acquit you just to go home." But as the pre-trial hearings dragged on, Isabella saw a change. Thorne's visits became less frequent. His signature confidence began to curdle into a strained impatience. The prosecution, it turned out, had a star witness, a former chief financial officer of Sterling Industries, a man named Robert Miller, who had been granted immunity in exchange for his testimony. Miller had the keys to the kingdom. He had the ledgers, the emails, the transaction histories. He had a story to tell, and it was the exact story Jasmine Reed wanted the jury to hear. The trial began on a sweltering July morning. The courtroom was a media circus. Sketch artists frantically captured Donovan's grim visage. Reporters tweeted every detail. Isabella sat in the back row of the public gallery, a small, still figure in a sea of frenzied activity. She had never been in a courtroom before, but she felt a fierce, protective loyalty that compelled her to be there. She was there for the man who, despite his cold exterior, had paid for her son's final year of college without a word when her savings were wiped out by a medical emergency. She was there for the man who she knew was more complicated than the monster portrayed by the prosecution. Jasmine Reed's opening statement was a masterpiece of righteous fury. She paced before the jury box, her voice ringing with conviction. She painted Donovan as a financial vampire, draining the lifeblood from hard-working Americans. "Look at him," she declared, pointing a finger directly at the defendant's table. "Donovan Sterling, a man who had everything, more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. But it wasn't enough. He wanted more. He wanted your money. The money in your 401ks, the money in your children's college funds, the money set aside for the sick and the vulnerable." Donovan sat impassively, his face a mask of stone. But Isabella saw the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for a glass of water. Marcus Thorne's opening was by contrast a dry, technical affair. He spoke of market fluctuations, risk assessment, and the complex nature of global finance. He tried to portray the prosecution's case as a gross oversimplification, a misunderstanding of legitimate business practices. But the narrative was lost. Reed had given the jury a villain. Thorne had given them a textbook. The first few days of the trial were a slow-motion catastrophe. Robert Miller, the star witness, was devastating on the stand. Guided by Reed's sharp questioning, he walked the jury through a labyrinth of documents, each one a nail in Donovan's coffin. He spoke of a secret ledger codenamed Project Nightingale, where millions were diverted from the company's main accounts. "And where did this money go, Mr. Miller?" Reed asked, her voice dripping with feigned curiosity. "To a series of untraceable accounts," Miller replied coolly. "From there it was wired to shell corporations in the Cayman Islands. The ultimate beneficiary in every single case was Donovan Sterling." Thorne's cross-examination was listless. He poked at minor inconsistencies, questioned dates, and quibbled over terminology, but he couldn't land a glove on Miller. The jury looked bored, then annoyed, then convinced. Isabella could feel the hope draining from the room, replaced by the cold certainty of a guilty verdict. The turning point came on the 5th day. The prosecution produced its trump card, They had obtained through a sealed warrant access to one of the Cayman Islands accounts, and they had a single damning withdrawal slip, a transfer of $10 million from the secret account to a vendor for the purchase of a rare blue diamond. The receipt for the diamond was made out to Donovan Sterling. It was the smoking gun, a direct link from the allegedly stolen funds to a personal luxury item. Isabella saw Marcus Thorne's face go pale. He shuffled his papers, his bravado evaporating under the harsh courtroom lights. During the lunch recess, he had a hushed, frantic argument with Donovan in the hallway. Isabella, standing a respectful distance away, couldn't hear the words, but she saw Thorne's gestures, sharp, dismissive final. When court reconvened, Jasmine Reed was practically glowing, sensing victory was near. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense man named Samuel Peters, looked down at the defense table. "Mr. Thorne, are you ready to call your first witness?" Judge Peters asked. Marcus Thorne stood up slowly. He straightened his tie, but the gesture lacked its usual crispness. He took a deep breath, not looking at his client, but at the judge. "Your Honor," Thorne began, his voice unusually high. "After a thorough review of the prosecution's latest evidence and a frank discussion with my client, it has become clear that there are irreconcilable differences in our legal strategy." A murmur went through the courtroom. Donovan Sterling, who had been staring at his hands, looked up at his lawyer, his eyes wide with disbelief. Thorne continued his voice, gaining a self-serving gravity. "I have a professional and ethical duty to this court and to my own conscience. I cannot in good faith continue to offer a defense in this matter. Therefore, effective immediately, I am withdrawing as counsel for Mr. Sterling." The courtroom exploded. The sound was a physical blow. Gasps, shouts from the reporters, the frantic clicking of cameras. Judge Peters banged his gavel, his face a thunderous mask of fury. "Order, order in this court!" But the damage was done. It was more than a withdrawal. It was a confession. The most expensive lawyer in New York had just in front of the jury, and the entire world declared his own client indefensible. He packed his pristine leather briefcase, turned his back on the man whose life was imploding, and walked out of the courtroom without a single backward glance. Donovan Sterling sat alone at the massive defense table. The mask was gone. In its place was the raw, naked shock of a man who had just been pushed off a cliff. He looked small, lost, and utterly, completely abandoned. The silence that followed Thorne's exit was heavier than any sound. It was the silence of a foregone conclusion. The silence of a guillotine waiting to fall. Jasmine Reed allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. It was over. Judge Peters, his jaw tight with anger at Thorne's unprofessional stunt, looked at the shell-shocked defendant. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice laced with a reluctant pity. "Given the extraordinary circumstances, this court will recess until tomorrow morning. I advise you to use that time to secure new counsel. We will reconvene at 10 a.m. As the judge banged his gavel, signaling the end of the day's proceedings, the reporters surged forward. Donovan didn't move. He just sat there, staring into the abyss that had just opened up at his feet. His empire, his name, his life, all gone. From the back of the courtroom, Isabella Rossi watched. Her heart ached not for the billionaire, but for the lonely man she served coffee to every morning. She saw the vultures circling the whispers, the smug looks, and in that moment something within her, a quiet strength, forged over years of silent resilience, caught fire. She saw not a lost cause, but a man who was being railroaded a story that was being told with all the wrong words. She stood up. Her legs felt unsteady, but her resolve was iron. She took a step forward, then another, walking down the center aisle past the bewildered reporters and the smirking paralegals. She walked until she was standing in the open space before the bench, her small frame a stark contrast to the imposing majesty of the law. The bailiff started to move towards her, but she didn't even notice. Her eyes were on the judge, who was still on the bench, gathering his papers, his expression one of pure exasperation. She took a deep breath, the air thick with the scent of old paper and human despair. And then she spoke, her voice clear and unwavering, a bell ringing in the suffocating silence. It wasn't loud, but it cut through every other sound in the room. "Your Honor." Judge Peters looked up, his irritations plain. "Citizen, the gallery is to remain silent. Court is adjourned." Isabella did not move. She lifted her chin, her gaze direct and unflinching. "Your Honor," she said again, a little louder this time, a lifetime of suppressed conviction pouring into the words. "That man," she said, pointing a steady finger toward the defense table, where Donovan Sterling was still sitting a statue of defeat. "He is not the person they say he is. His lawyer has abandoned him. So I will speak for him." A wave of confused, disbelieving silence swept the room. The reporters froze, their pens hovering over their notebooks. Jasmine Reed, who had been packing her own briefcase, turned around with a look of utter contemptuous amusement. Donovan Sterling slowly lifted his head, his eyes meeting Isabella's for what felt like the first time. He saw not his maid, but a woman of impossible courage. Judge Peters stared down at her, his expression unreadable. He had been a judge for 30 years. He had seen everything: mob bosses, terrorists, corrupt politicians. He had seen lawyers faint defendants, scream witnesses lie. But he had never in 3 decades on the bench seen anything like this. A maid, offering to defend her billionaire boss in the middle of a $100 million fraud trial. The absurdity of it was overwhelming. The bailiffs were now closing in on her. "Ma'am, you need to step back," one of them said, his hand resting on her arm. But Isabella's eyes never left the judge. She held her ground. And in her gaze, Judge Peters saw something he hadn't seen all trial. Not arrogance, not greed, not legal maneuvering. He saw truth, raw, unvarnished, and utterly terrifying in its sincerity. "Wait," the judge said, raising a hand to stop the bailiffs. The room held its breath. "I will defend him," Isabella Rossi repeated, her voice now ringing with the force of an oath. The courtroom, which moments before had been a vortex of noise and motion, was now suspended in a state of collective, breathless shock. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Jasmine Reed's smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated disbelief. She looked from the small, determined woman in the well of the court to the judge, expecting him to unleash a torrent of judicial fury. Contempt of court was the least of it. This was a mockery of the entire legal process. Judge Samuel Peters leaned forward, his elbows resting on the bench. He removed his spectacles and polished them slowly with a handkerchief, his eyes never leaving Isabella. It was a gesture she would later learn meant he was thinking, truly thinking, not just reacting. "Your name, please," he said, his voice a low rumble that commanded attention. "Isabella Rossi, Your Honor. And your relationship to the defendant, Mr. Sterling. I am his housekeeper, sir, for 22 years. A titter of laughter rippled through the gallery. The word housekeeper hung in the air, dripping with condescension. The sheer audacity of it was comical. Jasmine Reed rolled her eyes so extravagantly it was a performance in itself. "His housekeeper," Judge Peters repeated, his tone flat. He put his glasses back on. "Ms. Rossi, I admire your loyalty. It is a rare quality in this day and age. However, you seem to be under a grave misapprehension. This is a court of law, not a stage for melodrama. The defendant requires counsel, a licensed attorney versed in the federal rules of evidence and criminal procedure. Are you by any chance a member of the New York State Bar? No, Your Honor, Isabella said calmly. I am not. Then I'm afraid you cannot defend him, as you so dramatically put it. The judge said, his patience wearing thin. Bailiffs, please escort Miss Rossi from the well. But as the bailiffs gently took her arms, Isabella spoke again, her voice rising with an urgency that could not be ignored. Your Honor, please, she implored. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know the law, but I know the truth. And the truth isn't in those documents they keep showing. The truth is in the things no one else saw. The story they are telling is wrong, every word of it. And if you don't let me speak, the real story will die in this room today, and an innocent man will be sent to prison. She wasn't pleading. She was testifying. Her sincerity was a tangible force in the room. It was raw, unscripted, and powerful. Donovan Sterling, who had been paralyzed by the whiplash of betrayal and despair, finally found his voice. It was hoarse, a pale shadow of his usual commanding tone. Your Honor, let her speak. All eyes swiveled to him. It was the first time he had spoken directly to the court with any hint of emotion. Jasmine Reed shot to her feet. Objection. This is an absolute circus. The defendant is without counsel, and now he wants his maid to testify. What is she going to talk about? The proper way to fold a fitted sheet. This is a deliberate attempt to derail these proceedings and make a mockery of this court. I would be careful with your tone. Ms. Reed, Judge Peters warned, his eyes flashing with irritation. Mr. Thorne's little theatrical exit is the only mockery I've witnessed today. He has put this court in an untenable position. He looked back at Donovan. Mr. Sterling, you have the right to an attorney. I am prepared to grant you a continuance of several weeks if necessary to find a new one. And what lawyer would take my case now? Donovan asked, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. My own counsel just declared me guilty in front of the jury. It's over. Unless you let her speak. He looked at Isabella, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, desperation, or perhaps a sliver of genuine hope. Judge Peters was in a bind. The law was clear. A defendant could represent themselves pro se, but they couldn't have an unlicensed proxy speak for them. Yet the circumstances were unprecedented. Thorne's public abandonment had catastrophically prejudiced the jury. A mistrial was an option, but that would be a victory for Thorne's disruptive tactics and a massive waste of state resources. He looked at the faces of the jury. They were no longer bored or smug. They were utterly captivated. They were leaning forward, their eyes wide. This was more compelling than any lawyer's argument. This was human drama unfolding right in front of them, and perhaps in the deep, cynical heart of a 30-year veteran of the bench, a spark of curiosity was lit. What could a housekeeper possibly say? Ms. Reed, the judge said, turning to the fuming prosecutor. While I appreciate your passionate defense of legal procedure, the defense has the right to present its case. The defendant, now acting pro se, wishes to call a witness. Are you suggesting the prosecution has the right to determine who the defense can and cannot call to the stand? Reed was caught. No, Your Honor, but... Then I will hear from the witness. Judge Peters declared, his voice firm. He banged his gavel, once a sharp crack that silenced all argument. The jury will disregard the witness's prior outburst. Miss Rossi, you will take the stand tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. You will be placed under oath, and you will answer the questions put to you. Mr. Sterling, as you are now representing yourself, you will be responsible for conducting the direct examination. And Ms. Reed, he added, pinning her with a glare, you will have your opportunity for cross-examination. I suggest you use it wisely. Court is adjourned." The room erupted. It was a chaotic ballet of reporters running for the doors, lawyers buzzing in disbelief, and a public gallery animated by a single question. What just happened? Isabella was led away by a bailiff to a small conference room. A few minutes later, the door opened, and Donovan Sterling walked in. The security guard stood outside, giving them a semblance of privacy. He looked older than he had that morning. The armor of his wealth and power had been stripped away, leaving behind a man who looked weary and fragile. He stopped a few feet from her, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. For a long moment, he just looked at her. His expression, a complex mixture of gratitude, bewilderment, and profound embarrassment. "Isabella," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Why?" "Because they are lying," she said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Lying," he scoffed, a flicker of his old cynicism returning. "They have documents, receipts. They have a $10 million diamond." "I know about the diamond," she said. Donovan looked at her surprised. "I was the one who packed it," Isabella continued. "I remember the box. It came from a jeweler in Antwerp. You told me to wrap it carefully. You said it was going to a sick little girl." Donovan's head snapped up. "What did you say?" "A little girl. The daughter of that man. Your old friend, Thomas Caldwell. The one whose company went bankrupt. I remember you were on the phone with him for weeks. He was crying. He said his daughter Lily, her cancer had come back. He said her biggest wish was to see something beautiful, something from a fairy tale. You told me you were sending her a blue star to wish on." Donovan sank into a chair, his face pale. He stared at his hands. "You heard that. You weren't always quiet on the phone, Mr. Sterling," Isabella said gently. "Especially when you were angry. You were angry that his insurance wouldn't cover the experimental treatment. You were angry that the world was so unfair. I heard you tell him you would sell the devil your soul to save that little girl." Donovan didn't speak. He just sat there, the memory washing over him. Thomas Caldwell had been his partner in his very first venture decades ago. A falling out had driven them apart, but when Donovan heard about his old friend's misfortune, he had acted. Secretly, of course. Project Nightingale. Isabella said the code name that Robert Miller had made sounded so sinister. "That sounds like a project for nurses, for helping people, not for stealing." Donovan looked up, and for the first time since she'd known him, Isabella saw tears welling in his eyes. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man who didn't know how to show he had a heart. A man who was so terrified of being seen as soft or sentimental that he hid his acts of compassion behind a labyrinth of shell corporations and offshore accounts, making them indistinguishable from the very greed he despised. He had built his gilded cage so perfectly that he had trapped himself inside it. "They won't believe you, Isabella," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're my maid. They'll say I paid you, that I coached you. Reed will tear you to pieces on the stand." "Let her try," Isabella said, and in her eyes was a strength that Donovan Sterling, for all his billions, had never possessed. "All I have is the truth. I will just tell them what I saw." "And what did you see?" he asked, his voice full of a genuine curiosity he hadn't felt in years. "I saw a man who paid the mortgage for his doorman for a year after his wife got sick," she began. "I saw a man who anonymously funded the entire music program for a school in the Bronx because he read an article about them losing their funding. I saw the man who every Christmas would have me send a dozen of the finest cashmere blankets to a homeless shelter with a note that just said, 'From a friend.' I have the receipts for those blankets, Mr. Sterling. I kept them for the household budget." She paused, letting her words sink in. They have their story, Mr. Sterling. Tomorrow we will tell them ours. That night, Isabella didn't go home. She stayed in a hotel room paid for by a court voucher. She didn't sleep. She sat with a legal pad and a pen, not writing a legal argument, but making a list. A list of all the small, secret acts of kindness she had witnessed over 22 years. It was a long list. It was the only defense they had. It was the truth. The next morning, the courtroom buzzed with an electric tension that was almost unbearable. Every seat was taken. The press section overflowed into the aisles. This was no longer just a financial trial. It had become a public spectacle, a modern-day David and Goliath story, though no one was quite sure who was who. Donovan Sterling sat at the defense table wearing the same grey suit as the day before. But today, he wasn't looking at the table. He was looking at the witness stand where Isabella Rossi was about to be sworn in. He had a single yellow legal pad in front of him, filled with his own shaky handwriting notes they had discussed in a brief, intense meeting that morning. Isabella walked to the stand with a quiet composure that belied the thunderous beating of her heart. She wore a simple navy blue dress, her hair pulled back neatly. She looked directly at the jury as she took the oath, her voice clear and steady. "Please state your full name for the record," the clerk droned. "Isabella Maria Rossi." Donovan stood up. It was his turn to question her. He cleared his throat, feeling the eyes of the entire room on him. "Ms. Rossi," he began, his voice formal, "how long have you been in my employ?" 22 years, Mr. Sterling. "And in those 22 years, what have your duties primarily consisted of?" "I manage your household, sir. I oversee the cooking, the cleaning, the scheduling. I handle deliveries and correspondence. I make sure your life runs smoothly." Jasmine Reed, slouched at the prosecution table, let out an audible sigh of boredom, making sure the jury noticed. "And in handling my correspondence," Donovan continued, ignoring her. "What kind of items do you process?" "Bills, invitations, business letters, and requests," Isabella said. "Requests." "What kind of requests?" "Requests for help," she answered. "They come from everywhere. Old employees, people who read about you, distant relatives, total strangers. They ask for money for medical bills, for tuition for businesses that are failing." "And what do I do with these requests?" Donovan asked. "You throw most of them away," Isabella said honestly. "You call them vultures." A few jurors chuckled. This wasn't what they were expecting. "But not all of them," Donovan prompted. "No, not all of them." Isabella's gaze shifted to the jury. "Sometimes one will catch his eye. A story about a family who lost their home in a fire. A letter from a teacher in a poor school district needing books. He'll put that one aside. He never says anything. But a week later, I'll be asked to arrange a wire transfer from one of his personal accounts, always anonymous. He gets very angry if there's any chance his name could be attached to it." "Objection," Reed snapped, leaping to her feet. "Hearsay. The witness is testifying to the defendant's character, which is not at issue, and she has no personal knowledge of these alleged transactions." "Sustained on the grounds of hearsay," Judge Peters said. "Mr. Sterling, you must ask questions about things the witness personally saw or did. Confine your questions to facts, not feelings or interpretations." Donovan nodded, his face grim. This was harder than he thought. He glanced at his notes. "Ms. Rossi." He said, "Changing tactics. Let's talk about Project Nightingale." The name electrified the room. This was the heart of the prosecution's case. "The prosecution alleges," Donovan said, his voice steady, "that Project Nightingale was a secret ledger used to hide money I was stealing from my company." He paused. Do you have any direct knowledge of Project Nightingale? Yes, sir, I do, Isabella said. Jasmine Reed sat bolt upright. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. How? Donovan asked. You kept the ledger in the bottom drawer of your study desk, Isabella explained. It was a simple leather-bound book. It didn't have a name on it. But I saw you writing in it, and I was the one who mailed the letters and packages associated with it. So you are admitting the defendant kept a secret ledger, Reed called out, unable to help herself. Ms. Reed, I will have you removed, the judge warned. Proceed, Mr. Sterling. What was in this ledger, Ms. Rossi? Names, she said. And stories. It wasn't numbers, it was people. Each page had a name at the top. Underneath you would write down their situation, what they needed, and then a plan. Donovan took a deep breath. Do you recall any of the names in that book? I do. The first one was Samuel Briggs, she said. The name was spoken with perfect clarity. He was a security guard at your first office building 30 years ago. He wrote to you last year. His wife had Alzheimer's, and he had lost his pension when the security company he worked for went bust. He was about to lose his home. She looked at the jury. Mr. Sterling arranged for his mortgage to be paid off. Anonymously, he sent them a new furnace for the winter. I was the one who ordered it from the company in Poughkeepsie. I remember because the delivery man had trouble finding the address. Objection, Reed shouted. Relevance. What does this have to do with securities fraud? Your Honor. Donovan said, finding a strength he didn't know he had. The prosecution's entire case rests on their interpretation of where this money went. They claim it was for my personal enrichment. I'm attempting to provide an alternative explanation. The witness has direct knowledge. I'll allow it. Judge Peters ruled, his eyes fixed on Isabella. But be very careful, Mr. Sterling. Donovan nodded. Ms. Rossi, let us turn to the prosecution's Exhibit A. A $10 million blue diamond. He felt a wave of shame as he said the words. The prosecution claims I bought this for myself. Do you have any knowledge of this diamond? Yes, sir, she said firmly. I told you yesterday. I packed it myself. And where was it sent? To an address in Greenwich, Connecticut, the home of Mr. Thomas Caldwell. And who is Thomas Caldwell? Your first business partner. I looked him up after you took his call. The papers said his tech company had collapsed. He lost everything. And why? Donovan asked, his voice softening. Did I send a $10 million diamond to a man who was bankrupt? For his daughter, Isabella said, her own voice filling with emotion. Her name was Lily. She was 9 years old. She had a rare form of leukemia. Mr. Caldwell told you on the phone that the doctors had given up. He said she was fading. Her one dream was to see the Hope Diamond, because she thought it looked like a star from her fairy tale books. But she was too sick to travel. Isabella's gaze was now locked on the jury, and they were hanging on her every word. So you bought her one? Isabella continued, her voice trembling slightly. You called every dealer in the world until you found one, a flawless cornflower blue diamond. You told Mr. Caldwell to tell her it was a wishing star that fell from the sky just for her. You said you didn't care about the money. You said you just wanted her to have one beautiful thing to look at before she couldn't finish the sentence. A tear rolled down her cheek and she wiped it away with the back of her hand. The courtroom was utterly silent. The raw, heartbreaking humanity of the story was more powerful than any legal argument. Donovan Sterling stood motionless, the legal pad forgotten at his side. He had hidden this act so deeply, buried it under layers of transactions and shell companies, terrified of anyone seeing this moment of what he considered weakness. And here was Isabella, laying his soul bare in front of the world. After a long moment, he cleared his throat. "I have no further questions for this witness, Your Honor." Judge Peters nodded slowly. He looked at the prosecutor. "Ms. Reed, your witness." Jasmine Reed rose her face, a mask of controlled fury. She knew this folksy emotional narrative was poison to her carefully constructed case. She had to dismantle it. She had to destroy Isabella Rossi on the stand. "Ms. Rossi," she began, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "that was a very touching story. Truly, you have a wonderful imagination." "It's not my imagination," Isabella said. "It's the truth." "The truth?" Reed sneered. "Let's talk about the truth. You are Mr. Sterling's housekeeper, is that correct?" "Yes." "And he pays you a salary?" "Yes." "A generous salary, I imagine, for your loyalty." "He pays me what the job is worth," Isabella replied evenly. "And I'm sure a bonus for this performance is forthcoming," Reed said, gesturing to the witness stand. "Objection," Donovan called out. "Sustained." "Ms. Reed, you will not attack the witness," the judge warned. Reed changed tack. "So you are a housekeeper, not an accountant, not a financial analyst, not a lawyer." "That is correct." "Yet you claim to understand the inner workings of a multi-billion-dollar corporation and the defendant's most secret financial dealings." "I only claim to know what I saw and what I heard," Isabella said. "What you saw?" Reed mocked. "You saw a man keep a ledger. You packed a box. You overheard phone calls. Is that the extent of your evidence?" "I have more," Isabella said, quietly. Reed laughed. "Oh, do tell? Do you have transaction receipts? Wire transfer confirmations?" "No," Isabella said. "I have this." From the small purse at her side, she carefully removed a folded, slightly crumpled piece of paper. It was a child's drawing done in crayon. She handed it to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge, and then to Jasmine Reed. The drawing depicted a large, lopsided blue star in the sky. Below it was a stick figure of a little girl with yellow hair, a huge smile on her face. At the bottom, in shaky childish letters, it read, "Thank you for my wishing star. Love, Lily." Reed stared at it, speechless. It was so simple, so pure, it defied cynicism. "That," Isabella said, her voice ringing with clarity, "arrived by courier a week after I sent the diamond. It was addressed to Mr. Sterling. He looked at it for a long time, and then he told me to throw it away. He said it was just clutter." She paused, looking at Donovan with a sad, knowing expression. "But I didn't throw it away. I kept it. I thought, someday he might want to see it again. It is postmarked from Greenwich, Connecticut. The date is on the back." Jasmine Reed handed the drawing back, as if it were coated in acid. Her case, her beautiful logical case, built on numbers and statutes, was being dismantled by a child's drawing and the testimony of a maid. She had to regain control. "This is absurd. A drawing proves nothing. For all we know, you created this." "Then I suppose you should call Thomas Caldwell to the stand," Isabella suggested calmly. "Or perhaps you could check the visitor logs at the Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Mr. Sterling visited Lily 3 times. He wore a baseball cap and glasses, so no one would recognize him." "I know. I arranged the car service." Reed was flailing. "So your testimony is that Project Nightingale, the source of these tens of millions of dollars, was nothing more than the defendant's personal piggy bank for his secret acts of charity." "I don't know what you call it," Isabella said. "I called it the good book, because it was filled with good deeds. He hid his kindness the way other men hide their crimes. I think he was ashamed of it. He thought it was a weakness, but it is the strongest thing about him." Isabella turned her gaze from the prosecutor to her employer. "He is a difficult man, Mr. Sterling. He is cold and quiet, and he keeps everyone at a distance. But he is not a thief. He is not the monster you say he is. I have seen his soul, and it is a good one." She had not spoken to the jury or the judge or the prosecutor. In that last moment, she spoke only to him. Jasmine Reed stood in the center of the courtroom, the silence pressing in on her. She looked at Isabella's earnest face. She looked at the faces of the jury, many of whom had tears in their eyes. She looked at the child's drawing, now entered into evidence. And she knew, with a sinking certainty, that she had lost. There were no more questions she could ask that wouldn't make her look like a bully, a monster attacking this beacon of simple, honest truth. "No further questions," she mumbled, and retreated to her table defeated. Isabella's testimony was a seismic event. It didn't just rock the courtroom, it sent shockwaves through the entire media landscape. The evening news led with the story, "The Maid's testimony, billionaire, philanthropist, or financial fraudster." The narrative had been completely upended. Donovan Sterling was no longer a simple villain. He was a complex, tragic figure, an enigma defended by the one person who truly knew him. The child's drawing was reproduced in every newspaper, a potent symbol of innocence, in a world of cynical finance. Public opinion, once so vehemently against him, began to shift. Talk shows debated the nature of charity and the reclusive billionaire's strange methods. Legal experts argued over Judge Peters's unprecedented decision to allow the testimony, but most agreed it had irrevocably altered the trial's trajectory. For Jasmine Reed, it was a nightmare. Her case, once a slam dunk, was now mired in emotional ambiguity. She could bring in all the accountants in the world to talk about wire transfers and shell corporations, but she had no way to rebut the story of a dying little girl and a wishing star. To do so would be to attack the memory of a dead child, a move so monstrous not even she could contemplate it. But the most profound impact was not in the media or on the prosecution. It was on one young man watching the news from his apartment in Brooklyn. Leo Sterling Donovan's only son watched the reports with a growing sense of horror and shame. Leo's relationship with his father was a wasteland of unspoken resentment. He saw his father as a cold, calculating machine who valued his business more than his own family. It was Leo, in a fit of bitter rage after a particularly cold and dismissive phone call, who had anonymously leaked the initial documents to a journalist who in turn had taken them to the SEC. He hadn't known the whole story, only that the Project Nightingale account existed, and that it seemed shady. He wanted to hurt his father, to knock him off his pedestal. He had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, and now he was suffocating under the weight of his actions. He watched Isabella on the screen, a woman he vaguely remembered from his childhood visits to the penthouse, a quiet presence who always had a kind word for him. He heard her stories, the doorman's mortgage, the school music program, things he'd never known. And then he heard the story of Lily Caldwell. He remembered Lily. She had been his childhood friend before his father and Thomas Caldwell had their falling out. He never knew she had gotten sick. The truth crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. The money he thought his father was hoarding for himself was being used to save the life of his own friend. The monster he had helped create for the world was a fiction. His father wasn't a criminal. He was a flawed, emotionally constipated man who performed acts of profound goodness in the most convoluted, secretive way imaginable. The next morning, before court was set to reconvene for closing arguments, a stunned Jasmine Reed was informed that a new witness had come forward for the defense. It was Leo Sterling. When Leo took the stand, The courtroom fell into a hushed reverence. He was the missing piece of the puzzle. Looking directly at his father, his voice choked with a guilt that was plain for all to see, he confessed everything. He told the court how he had stolen the partial documents, driven by anger and a lifetime of perceived neglect. "I didn't understand," Leo said, his eyes pleading with his father for a forgiveness he didn't deserve. "I saw the transactions, the offshore accounts. I assumed the worst. I wanted to believe the worst. It was easier than admitting I just didn't know him." He then provided the context that Robert Miller, the prosecution's star witness, had conveniently omitted. Miller had been in on the philanthropic ventures, but when Donovan refused to give him a massive management fee for his silence, he had gone to the authorities, twisting the narrative for his own gain and an immunity deal. Leo produced emails between himself and Miller that corroborated this communications he had saved, never thinking he would need them. It was over. The prosecution's case didn't just have holes in it, it had been utterly and completely demolished. 2 hours later, after a perfunctory closing argument from Donovan where he simply said, "Ms. Rossi and my son have already told you the truth," the jury was sent to deliberate. They returned in 20 minutes. On the charge of securities fraud, the foreman announced, his voice echoing in the silent room. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Donovan Sterling, not guilty." The words hung in the air. A wave of relief so powerful it was dizzying washed over Donovan. He didn't smile. He simply closed his eyes, his shoulders slumping as the weight of the past year lifted from him. On the charge of wire fraud, we find the defendant not guilty. On the charge of money laundering, we find the defendant not guilty. The courtroom erupted in applause. Reporters scrambled. In the gallery, Isabella Rossi allowed herself a single, deep, contented sigh. She had done it. She had told the truth, and the truth had been enough. That evening, the penthouse on Park Avenue was for the first time in years not silent. Leo was there. The two men stood by the large window, not looking at the city, but at each other. There were years of pain and misunderstanding between them, a chasm that wouldn't be bridged in a single night. But for the first time, they were on the same side of it. "I'm sorry, Dad." Leo said the words he had longed to say, finally coming out. Donovan just nodded, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. It was an awkward gesture, but it was a start. A few moments later, Isabella entered the room. She was carrying a tray, not with coffee, but with 3 glasses and a bottle of sparkling water. She placed it on the table. Donovan turned to her. The titan of industry, the billionaire who could buy and sell countries, looked at his housekeeper. He had no words. "Thank you" felt insultingly small. How do you thank someone for giving you back your life, for showing you a part of yourself you had tried to bury? He walked over to the one object in the room that held any warmth, the portrait of his late wife, her smile a beacon of a life lived with open joy. He reached behind the frame and took out a small faded photograph. It was of him, his wife, and a very young Leo, all of them laughing on a beach. It was a picture of a man he had forgotten he could be. He walked back to Isabella and handed her the photograph. "My wife, Sophia," he said, his voice thick. "She always said, 'The measure of a person is not what they have, but what they give away.'" He looked at Isabella, his eyes finally clear. "She would have liked you, Isabella." It was the highest compliment he was capable of giving. It was more than enough. Isabella smiled a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. "I know, Mr. Sterling," she said softly. "I know." She had not just saved a billionaire in court. She had, in her own quiet way, reminded a father a son, and the world that the most valuable things in life are never recorded on a balance sheet. They are recorded in the quiet acts of kindness that, if you are lucky, someone is there to witness. In a world that often celebrates cynicism, the story of Isabella Rossi is a powerful reminder that courage and truth can come from the most unexpected places. It wasn't a high-powered lawyer or a brilliant legal strategy that saved Donovan Sterling. It was the unwavering loyalty and simple, honest testimony of a woman who saw the good in a man the world had already condemned. Her voice, born not of legal training, but of human decency, cut through the noise of accusation and reminded an entire city that character is built in the quiet moments, not in the public spotlight. This story proves that one person armed with the truth can indeed change the world for someone. If this story of incredible loyalty and unexpected justice moved you, please give this video a like and share it with others who need to hear a story of hope. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true stories that will inspire and amaze you. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an update.